Thank you very much. Everyone hear me? I'm Alison Stewart, Deputy CEO for Infrastructure Victoria. Thank you very much to all the presenters and for all the very interesting thoughts today. I had a question that was actually largely for Dena and Marc, but potentially I think Jarrah might have an opinion as well. It's really about targets. And Marc, I noticed, you said that your target is to be net zero embodied carbon by 2025. You have an interim target of 20%. What's that compared to? And similar question to Dena, just when we're setting those interim targets in terms of how we want industry to progress and really respond to targets, what is it that we're comparing against? How are we actually going to are we investing the appropriate amount of effort into those interim targets versus actually noting that our target is to get to zero, and the faster we can get there, the better, which is sort of where I think you were going.
Just to test the technology. Is Dena still on the?
Yeah, he's still on.
Yeah. Would you like me to go first or?
Yes, go ahead, Dena.
Yeah.
She's muted. I think you're muted.
Sorry, did you want me to go first?
Yes, please.
Yes, okay. So your question was what's the reduction relative to? I think the first thing we need to do before we can set targets is start measuring embodied emissions. And that's the space that the Sustainable Buildings SEP, the planning policy is. And that's the space that we'll be in as well. We can't set any targets until we know where we are today. So that's one thing, and that'll give us something to, measure relative to. The other thing to keep in mind is as we develop calculators to try and build in some way of measuring what BAU looks like today, and to have a way of keeping an eye on what BAU looks like as there's progress, so we can update what that measurement is relative to. And there are calculators out there that do provide a BAU baseline for measurement as it is now. And I think it's important that whatever calculator we do end up using as government does provide that to help with this very question.
Thanks. And Marc, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I guess in terms of setting that 20% reduction in the interim, we really just wanted to send a bit of a signal and set a consistent target out there for all projects, just to be able to provide that direction. We weren't sure sort of where that 20% was going to come from, but we did have some prior experience in projects that showed that we were able to achieve 20% relatively sort of easy, as long as you were sort of measuring and looking at it up front. So that's where that sort of target came from. It was also informed by and supported by the Green Star Buildings tool. So they've also set a 20% reduction target for them to use any new buildings to achieve a credit under their embodied carbon area. So we can see that that's the first place to start, but it's definitely not the end. But it's also worth acknowledging that we currently don't have, the supply chains, the materials to produce like a true net zero embodied carbon building. There is going to be offsets involved. That's just part of the thing. We'd love to be able to, produce everything that has a zero carbon impact, a building with that. But yeah, that's sort of just flagging that will be involved if we want to get to the target sooner. We're using that as a way to set sort of a bit of a price or a budget against that carbon. So the more we can do to reduce carbon through design, through different materials, means that you don't have to offset that. So therefore, you're avoiding a cost in that. So we're using that as a bit of a financial impact as well.
Great. So we might, Dena and Simon, just so we manage the technological changes, we might say thank you very much for your presentations, and please I know, Dena, you've put your email into the chat, and I'm sure, Simon, you'd be happy to put yourself and Rosie down there if people have an interest in following up on what we know is a really important conversation around how you create an equitable transition, engaging manufacturers and thinking outside the box in that third horizon of the biomaterials as we move to a greater a world of a more sustainable world. Then thank you, but we'll probably leave those questions there and you can continue to chat online. So we might open up the conversation here between our panelists and ensuring that, yeah, I'll do that, Ros. Ensuring and that we do that. So, okay.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Anna Song. I'm actually from the advocacy NGO sector, but I used to work in government for a long time. And just a super quick follow-up to the last question. I was wondering whether any of the jurisdictions, as well as the Commonwealth, I am aware from my time in government that a couple of years ago, there was building code reform that Victoria was driving. Victoria Building Authority was the lead agency. But as part of that conversation, there was also a need for consistency and potentially nationalize the system. So you can, undo some of the inefficiencies created purely by the fact that we exist in a Commonwealth. And that gives rise to a lot of administrative, regulatory barriers. So for those still inside government, I wonder whether it's worth following up. So the infrastructure people in the public service and the building policy and practitioner part of the public service are talking to each other. But I do have a question that's different in gear, which is especially for the corporates in the room, which is I deeply understand the uncertainty that you're facing, especially when you talk to your investors. But what is the number for that consistent demand, that scale, to give confidence to your investors that some of the technology that is yet being tested in a commercial sense is all but ready to give dividend, but they do need to pay for it and invest for it, because in that cycle of cash flow, they are holding on to a really great proportion of wealth, let's be honest. And if they don't unlock that wealth quickly, they're actually going to be delayed in seeing dividends for themselves of the return. And in the meantime, we're going to have rising degrees of temperature, which is going to make everyone's job just a little bit more difficult.
You want to make a comment on the government's question first, and then we might go to the corporate side.
I mean, yeah, government is pretty unwieldy, I'll say that, and that's I've already been there a year, and I still cannot find who I need to speak to anyway. So being able to know, what's happening in other parts of government, at other levels of government, like we all need to connect, yes. And I'm not sure how to do that, but I did mention in my presentation that one of the biggest challenges is just information. So who's doing what, who wants what, who has what, it's just about those flows of information. And it's nearly as important as that actual flow of the physical asset and the materials that we actually are speaking about today. So attaching data to that may be our first big step.
And lots of the tools that are coming out there will hopefully help in that space as well. So we heard about the neighbours embodied carbon process, but there's several other research and education institutions coming out in the private sector as well that will actually help government, whether that's at state or federal level, actually start to set mandates and targets around what does it mean to build or to have it into a code. Because right now it's still like how do you actually measure it consistently and set a target to track towards that. That's still a challenge. And sometimes we also get held up on that challenge and say, oh, we're waiting for the right numbers rather than just going out there and getting the job done. We heard that there's materials and solutions out there and available. So sometimes we do need to just start with a little bit of imperfection And coming to, I guess, the investor value piece, I was talking last week about value engineering. So in engineering, go through a design process, you start to carve out all the excess things. You can reduce the amount of steel or concrete, still get the same strength outcomes. You're tweaking the design. But at some point, value engineering became a cost-cutting exercise. And I'm trying to bring the value back into value engineering that is more than economics. And so as an investor, it's like, yes, what are the minimum economic hurdles? But also what are the other values that we're driving, whether it's carbon, whether it's social, whether it's SDGs? How are you starting to track and measure that in that investment lens? Because we need to have a different discussion about value. It's not just economics, that whole system needs to shift, and it is shifting. To Simon's credit, he wants to get away from talking ESG, but ESG is how we're valuing that right now in a monetary sense. So we do need to talk that language, and we do need to come up with metrics, whether it's sustainability linked loans, finance, and otherwise. And different investors have different appetites and different hurdles.
Anyone, Ros or Marc, do you want to make a comment on that? Okay.
Anthony Lieberman from the Australian Institute of Quantity Surveyors. Just wanted to turn the focus to contracts and procurement. So how do you now deal with contractors when you're looking at the reduction of embodied carbon? You obviously start with your overall budget. How does it then flow through, and actually where's the risk? Who's bearing the risk for the reduction?
I think in terms of, and this probably doesn't answer your question at all, but in terms of how we actually enable those reductions, it's around giving the contractor flexibility. So I think that's enabling that innovation. Sorry, you tweaked something in my memory from a conversation from last week, but and then I think the actual robust outcomes need to come with some really strict contract management, which doesn't always occur. So it's translating, from innovation through to actually delivering.
Yeah, and we're challenging ourselves right now, looking at our next couple of development opportunities to have exactly that discussion. So we're looking, first of all, carbon budgets aligned with our 2030 targets. So where do we need to be for those projects by their construction phase, delivery? And then what does it mean to go beyond that? And do we start to set up contractor incentives? Do we have investment funds to say, well, if we want to drive decarbonisation beyond that, how are we incentivising those contractors to do that? And we can do that by a proxy price on carbon. We know the carbon intensity that we're looking at, and albeit it's not a perfect science, but it's enough that we can start having those discussions. The other target that I didn't speak to is our regular purchase goods and services and embodied energy or carbon just to run our business. On the last couple of years, we've been asking all of our major suppliers to actually disclose their carbon through CDP, through ourselves. We're moving away from using industry averages against our spend to really being supplier-specific data points. And now we're trying to map the maturity of our technology suppliers compared to our corporate services suppliers or engineering suppliers. And then ideally having different targets based on industry maturity. Who can really rapidly shift to renewable energy as a supplier, and at what point do we just make that a requirement for doing business with Transurban, and giving them enough lead time and actually hearing their barriers and hurdles, like how do we upskill them, help them hit our own requirements. So it's a complex space.
I'll probably just talk a little bit about how all this is quite recent. So there's only probably contracts in the last 6 to 12 months where we've gone out to tender specifically having set targets around minimum and sort of aspirational embodied carbon reduction for our buildings. And so we're seeing initially sort of a bit of a hesitant response from builders, but more recently you're starting to see some builders really build up the capability they have internally to be able to use embodied carbon reduction as a point of difference, as a competitive advantage against maybe some of the other builders. So, you know, a recent tender that we're going through is, you know, we've got a 30% reduction target. We've got some builders saying, and it's specifically called out in our qualitative sort of evaluation metrics, oh, we think we'll be able to get to 40% easy, no budget sort of increase, and so things like that. So they are using it to essentially win jobs by by having that capability now. So I guess ultimately it's really quite new. So we will start to progress and get more sophisticated about how we might incentivize reduction and things like that. But just for us, even calling it out and having targets mentioned in our tenders is a good step forward. Yeah, and we're seeing really good responses.
And I'll just add, I guess, typically we've learned from CBUS Properties perspective, and so their learnings we use then to have discussions with our property or infrastructure managers. And I think that feedback loop that I spoke of right back at the start is that we all need to continue to share the knowledge that we have, and to a point made earlier on, I think the role that MECLA can play in terms of bringing all the variety of actors together so that we can share this knowledge is actually really imperative.
Yeah, it's that generosity of knowledge that people are really engaging in, and just reflecting on Infrastructure Partnerships Australia and their recent report around decarbonising carbon and putting it into the business case, and that's where that risk issue comes in. They say, well, we've done cost quality for a long time, but we have to include carbon in there as well as one of the key measures of success. We have another question.
I'll just add to that one as well. Even before you get to the carbon reduction target piece, I mean, we started with specifying infrastructure sustainability ratings, green star ratings. You can specify, just use a particular tool. You can specify parts of that tool, say, but as a minimum in the carbon bit, deliver X level within that tool. And so that's probably where we started that journey, was saying, well, these 6 or 7 credits are critical or material to our organisation. Climate change resilience, we haven't gotten into the resilience aspect yet. But yeah, so that's where we started, and then that still leaves the contractor and the designers the flexibility to say overall, how do we then balance some of the competing interests that these things also set up.
Yeah, hi, I'm David Law from the consultancy firm Oracle. This is a bit of an open question as representatives of the finance sector. We've heard a lot today about building things better, but are there any efforts in the industry when you're considering the investment decisions around building less or even not building something for environmental reasons?
I guess the way that I would answer that question is that there is limited new build opportunity. So for the built environment sector to achieve net zero carbon, it's going to come with retrofits and refurbishments. We can't keep knocking down everything and just rebuilding it again and again and again. There's a lot of challenges in that, but there is, I guess you would say, embodied carbon savings to that. We currently don't have any live real projects that are going through those sort of significant retrofit opportunities, but there will be, and there's going to need to be for us as a city and us as a country to get our built environment sector down to net zero carbon. So that's how I'd answer that question. Yeah, there's limited scope, capability to keep building. Retrofit is an opportunity, and it's where a lot of jobs and value creation will be focusing on that. So organisations or companies or contractors, builders that know how to do that well, will also be able to deliver an efficient outcome there.
It is a really tough question. We don't really get involved in a lot of refurbs, but we do have a couple of fairly substantial, 5,000 square metres existing buildings that we are refurbishing. But we do demand that when a project is in the design phase, that there's a whole of life carbon footprint undertaken, and that sometimes demands that we try to reuse something, or that we really get stuck into what are the repurposing opportunities available to components of the building without demolishing or completely turning something back into gravel. What can we do to actually reduce that whole of life carbon? And we do have a really exciting project at the moment where we're looking at, what's the difference between refurbishing a project as opposed to designing a project that might last 100 years? Like what is the answer that we will select? And it is never easy to actually have that conversation. and to repurpose the building, time, cost, carbon, the quality of the building, the durability, the longevity, the public value. It's never as simple as that one metric.
That same question keeps coming up in each of our spotlight events, so I think it's going to be more and more an issue that we have to really think about, that whole of life carbon and the decision-making points, particularly in that pre-design phase. So we have another question here.
Hi, my name is Fei Wan from Infrastructure Victoria. So my colleague just left, but David's question and your answer really is a good segue for my question, which is some of your speakers kind of touched on, which is the life cycle perspective of asset development and management. And Jarrah, you mentioned about there's perhaps competing interest between the decarbonisation of infrastructure and also climate resilience, in a sense that you mentioned an example, material reduction, which is a cost cutting as well. But my thinking is, if you reduce some material quantity, how does that play out in asset management, kind of long-term perspective, also climate adaptation, in the sense that we have to be making infrastructure more durable, sustainable, longer term, etc. So, and yeah, so sorry, Claire. Yeah, so Claire, you're summarising basically the conundrum of the government, needed to set a very clear signal for industry, for investment, for designers, but we're facing a lot of information gaps, barriers, and also these interdependencies between the upfront investment decision. We cannot see through the whole life cycle kind of impact, but yet we needed to make some decisions up early on to give a very clear framework. So I would like you to comment or feedback, and also try to understand what MECLA is doing in this space. Thank you.
Thanks, Faye. Yeah, definitely not a competing interest when I'm talking materials and climate resilience. Probably more to David's point about actually building resilience in our assets so we don't have to keep rebuilding them. A lot of new materials that are coming through actually do have similar properties, stronger properties, or just different properties. And it's upskilling the industry to know how to use those to their best effect. And it's that opportunity to plan for the future and plan for the uncertainty of the future, whether that's climate resilience, whether that's future redundancy. We're looking at future road tunnels. We design big ventilation systems to deal with car exhaust. But fast forward 20, 30 years, and I'm very hopeful that there will be very little car exhaust happening out there on our streets. Mm-hmm. So why are we designing big ventilation systems still? Or how are we provisioning for future decommissioning of those future use cases? So the same thing with materials, but our infrastructure when it comes to climate resilience. What do we need to tweak, modify, and do it early in the life cycle models? Mm. So when we're looking at asset life cycle resilience, we're developing adaptation management plans for all of our assets. And that's sort of going a step beyond initially doing a climate risk assessment to say, now what are we doing about it? And when do we need to do it by? And so that's now, we're looking at how do we factor that into our economic models from an investment perspective, making sure we're looking at that whole of life cost and return with investors as well. So it is that full life cycle picture of understanding when to actually step in and change. Yeah, we'll leave it at that one.
Right, we have one more question here, and that will be our last question.
Thanks, Monica. I'm Leilani from Rest Super, and my question is probably a broader one around super funds are holding so much capital, and there has been a lot of focus on, allocating that to nation building projects. And so I guess my question is, what are the best questions super funds as investors can be asking to make sure we get the right outcomes on these projects? And Jarrah, I'm probably looking at you because I think you said you had a vast range. So I guess it's what's the most helpful to get great outcomes?
Great question.
Yeah, and I think the most helpful is something Rosie touched on earlier, which is actually to develop a relationship with your asset managers. And to move away from sort of single questions and actually having ongoing engagement. And that's the most valuable for both parties. Because the question will only ever be a snapshot in time. And the response to some of those questions sometimes comes without context. If you look at our forecast trajectory that I have on the screen before, last year we didn't hit our reduction pathway. The easy answer is the wind farm that we were partnering with was delayed by 6 to 12 months. The questions were like, some of our investors were like, you're not on your trajectory, what does that mean? It's like, well, actually, it's natural. We're trying to encourage more renewable development on the grid. We're investing in new wind farms. They were delayed, simple. Any questions are good questions. It helps build understanding. But really what's going to create maturity and understanding is that two-way dialogue and knowing that you want more than a single metric. That's how you actually build transparency, trust that these organisations are acting with integrity rather than just putting up a flashy slideshow.
I absolutely agree with everything you just said. Other components of our climate roadmap, or if you think about the positioning of our roadmap, its actions and measurement, a big part of that is alignment with our managers and our assets. So getting them to understand where we're at in terms of our own commitments, understanding where they're at, and continuing to, as I said, that feedback loop, that sharing of knowledge. And then when you do ask for information, you tell them, this is how your benchmark's not a lovely word, but how you are compared to others, or I've seen this elsewhere. Have you considered our sophistication grows, their sophistication grows, and it doesn't stay with one asset class either. You can share it, from property to infrastructure to our listed assets as well. So I think, increased alignment and sharing of knowledge is absolutely key.
All right, well, that brings us to a conclusion. I think we're at our 11:30 mark now. So I want to thank our speakers, Ros, Marc, Jarrah, Claire and Dena and Simon online. Thank you very much for being part of our conversation today. I thought that was really just thank you to people who came, and thank you to the people online. I mean, as you hear, MECLA is really a broad ecosystem trying to address those key barriers to the uptake of embodied carbon, drive material suppliers to feel confident that they can continue to invest in innovation as we really drive those challenges. And I think for the finance sector, one sort of thought piece for me is that maybe there's a little sheet. What are the good questions for the finance sector to be asking companies around helping to drive that change, but address that change as well, particularly as there is billions going into infrastructure investment, and it might be something useful for government agencies as well. So thanks very much. We have an event coming up next week in Queensland. For those of you who are nationally based, this should be a very exciting event for engaging Brisbane Olympics 2032, 10 years away. Wow, we have to be building the infrastructure that drives down embodied carbon and really putting in place facilities and thinking about those legacy emissions and legacy projects that are going to be built. And then on the 6th of December, our last spotlight event for the year will be around regenerative materials. So watch this space as we sort of engage in that third horizon of materials coming down the pipeline. So thank you for participating. Thanks for those of you online. This will be recorded. It'll go up on our website. Any questions, please be in touch. Otherwise, thanks very much to our speakers.